Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jorgen Sevild. I'm based in Hong Kong, where I'm the Managing Director of Inqova Technologies, that I'll dive a little bit more into who we are and what we do. I've been invited here today to speak about Industry 4.0 and how digitalization is reshaping the leather value chain. So some of the key things here that we're going to be talking about is specifically, of course, breaking down Industry 4.0, looking at digitalization, and of course also how this specifically also works in the leather industry and where we are right now. So I'm also hoping to, jumping a little bit ahead here, some of the key things that I hope that we can go through today that I hope you'll get to take away from this as well is I'm going to go over a brief foundation. Technology can very often be a bit confusing and there's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of things out there. So I'm first of all just going to go through a quick foundation of what some of these terms are and break that down. And then we're going to be looking at applying that to the leather value chain and looking at the leather value chain 4.0, let's call it, and some of the action steps that are available for brands and retailers out there, and also leather manufacturers in the industry. I want to just make some clarifications at the beginning that as I'm speaking about leather in particular throughout the presentation, I'll be focusing on natural leather and also talking more about manufacturing in China and in Asia, as I'm based in Hong Kong. And most of my experience with the leather industry comes from working with chemical companies and tanneries and product makers and brands in China and in Asia. So before we dive into the leather of this, just a little bit of quick background about myself. I've been in Hong Kong for about 10 years. I'm originally from Norway myself, and I've been working in the manufacturing space here for about 6-7 years, specifically working then with China. And a lot of my background comes from denim and textiles and apparel manufacturing. And especially in the last few years, I've been working with leather manufacturing as well, going as a good combination with the leather industry and the jeans and the cowboy boots together. What I do with Inqova, and I co-founded Inqova about three years ago. And what we do specifically is that we work with manufacturers around the world. We work on how manufacturers connect, communicate, and grow, and specifically also Industry 4.0 basically in practice every single day, specifically for textiles and apparel manufacturers and also leather manufacturers. So in summary, what we do is basically working with progressive manufacturers that are forward-thinking in global supply chains, and we leverage digitalization for more than just the idea of going digital, but also for positive social and environmental impact. So what does that really mean? The core services that we offer from Inqova is mainly within design of technology and solutions. We do technology development, and we also do full service digital marketing, specifically focusing then, as I said, on leather industry, textiles and apparel, and specifically also within denim in that space. So to summarize from a little bit more visual point of view, we operate as a consultancy, as an agency, where we, in very simple terms, we solve the problems and we also implement the solutions and execute solutions to them. We work with manufacturers and with our clients very closely over time, and it's very much of a partnership where we nurture digital over time and not just on a simple project basis. So let me see here. Just to give a little bit more context, the leather industry was also that last year I was fortunate enough to be involved with the Chrome-Free Leather Alliance's founding in China, together with Francis Chang, who's also from Hong Kong and is also currently based in China. The Chrome-Free Leather Alliance is dedicated to improving the leather value chain, specifically in China for China, by highlighting innovative tanning methods and the benefits of investing in a chrome-free future. I think for some of you may already know, also specifically within China, that there's new regulations and there are new chrome-free alternatives coming to the market. I'm not in any way saying and kind of talking against chromium, but this is also just to give some context of what my involvement in the leather industry is as well. So that's a little bit about myself, and diving also a little bit, as I said, into some foundation before we start breaking down and what this applies and how this works in the leather value chain. Let's just look at a few key concepts and a few key definitions first. So before we go into here, I think most of you are very familiar with this, but just to simplify in a very simple model, when we talk about the leather value chain, what we mean is we talk about then step number one, the inputs, the natural heights, the chemicals, the water, the energy, the raw materials that goes into the process. Then the processing and the different tanning processes of the hide, and then also the leather goods making processes before eventually the products end up in a retail store and being sold to consumers. So this is just to clarify when we talk about the leather value chain in a very high level, simple way. when we talk about Industry 4.0, I felt like that needed a little bit of context. And some of you may already know this, but just to give a bit of brief context to that is when we say Industry 4.0 or 1.0 or 2.0 and these things, we're very much talking about the industrial revolutions. So I'm not here to talk about steam and electricity and these things, but to go all the way back from the beginning around the end of the 17th century, we had steam engines and the innovations and how that affected industrial manufacturing. Then we moved on to Industry 2.0, which was affected by electricity towards the end of the 1800s. And as we saw towards the end of the 1960s, then we started moving into computation in manufacturing. And that started to make things a little bit more digital. And what we're talking about right now with Industry 4.0 is this connectedness between machines and digital applications. So what I'm going to be focusing on is a little bit more specifically towards the difference between 3.0 and 4.0 in this space. So let's bring this back to leather and let's look at some of the key things. When we go from, say, the 17th century and Industry 1.0 to where we are today, we need to look at innovation. And as Anson Bailey just mentioned also, that we look at, for example, material innovation in the leather industry and talking about natural leather, we don't really necessarily innovate that much on the natural hide, although that there's room for that as well. But let's look specifically at, for example, like chemicals, and where we're now also seeing innovation on chrome-free chemicals, where Smith & Son and NERA has now been creating a new product called 𝐶ology, and they've been developing this chemical and this material innovation that allows us to process the hides differently without the use of chromium. We now also can look at an industrial innovation that then talks more about the processing of physical raw materials. So now we're talking about the machinery, the efficiency and the productivity of how we process materials. And this is something we're all familiar with. When we're going forward and talking about digital innovation, we're then talking about the processing of digital raw materials. So what does that really mean? So let's look a little bit into what digital is exactly and how that affects the leather industry. So we need to talk a little bit about digital, the word digital. So when we say digital, we basically means making something into electronic form. So this happened very much in the Industry 3.0 era, when we then talked about turning something into zeros and ones and binary codes and something that's basically electronic form and is machine readable by computers. That's something we're all very familiar with, but it's also readable and a language that only computers understand. So when we look at the next part of it, when we talk about digitizing, then we're talking about creating digital assets. So talking about something that we just talked about, digital raw materials and materials that can be used in processing. In this case, I've put up an example of an image here of a leather. And this can then be used, for example, in 3D applications. Then we're talking about the next part, which is digitalize. So when we're digitalizing, then we're talking more about process and about workflow. So first step is about making something digital, and then when we're the process of digitizing is making, for example, then an actual natural leather digital, and we're creating then a digital twin, we can call it. And then it's about how we work with that digital twin in the digital processing and these workflows. So what's really the difference between 3.0 and 4.0? And just to summarize that is that 3.0 was very much just about talking about digital. And what we're talking about now about in Industry 4.0 is very much about smart and autonomous systems that is fueled by data. And we're talking then about machine learning, which is a way of processing this data. And again, back to the smart and autonomous, meaning that these things can kind of learn on their own and improve on their own, and to give us more than just the raw data, but give us insights. So that an important keyword to really think about if you want to look deeper into Industry 4.0 and some of the science behind it, simulation is a very important keyword, because as we need from a scientific perspective, we need data that we feed into simulation models, and these simulation models then give us better predictions of not just the future, but as we'll be looking at also the processing of physical materials as well. So that we're able to simulate how we're processing the real world materials, but in a digital space that allows us to not utilize these natural raw material and not deplete the natural raw materials. So that's a little bit of, just to summarize also what we just looked at, was basically going from looking at the leather value chain and breaking that down from a high level, and also looking at a little bit of the background from Industry 1.0 to 4.0, and breaking down digital and the different words of digital there, and talking about what's the difference between Industry 3.0 to Industry 4.0. So now let's talk a little bit about going into let's list 5 potential business opportunities for the leather value chain. We could really, this also requires me to talk a little bit broadly about some of these main business units and where we can look at opportunities there. And of course, this is really down to each and one company to think about how this can be done with each one of you. So we'll go into a little bit of that broadly after. But let's look at the first part of it is very much in terms of operation. So a lot of you may have heard about Internet of Things, and when we talk about Industry 4.0, we talk about IoT as a big term. So that's again also a big term that can mean many things, but let's talk about it, for example, around how we're collecting data and how we connect our machines and how that actually helps us in the way that we run our operations. So if we give an example that I'm sure you're all familiar with also is smartwatches, and the way we're now, a lot of us is monitoring our health using smartwatches. And that's basically then collecting data from our own body and from our own machinery, collecting data about our heart rates and about our health condition and the performance of our body that is then collected from our body and then is brought back to, say, a data center that we can process that data, and we can then be able to predict better how the human body works and how the performance will be in the future. So when we're talking about operations optimization, in this case, it's very much about collecting this data from the machinery in the factories and then use that data in simulation models to be able to tell us where the machines need attention. So on a more manufacturing level, this would mean then, for example, on maintenance, which machines need maintenance before others, which is almost like a human body that tells us when you need to go to the doctor or when something needs to be looked after. With the systems that we have in place, they're in the leather value chain, is also they're going from traditional ERP systems, but has then been very much storing of data and just a lot of manual processing of data and going into smart production systems and looking at taking the data that we've been capturing, or a lot of companies have been capturing for a long time, and being able to use that data to simulate it, to predict the future, and to be able to tell us where we need to pay attention. So that's number one. Number two is also a space that we've worked a little bit more specifically in is logistics optimization. Anson talked a little bit about this as well, and we've been working very much in Hong Kong with a company called Topo Solutions on this. I'm going to use them as an example. And the data that we're now talking about is very much, say, quality data and tracking data, inbound and outbound logistics in the supply chain. From company to company. So here we're talking about predictability and proactive planning. So what, for example, Topo Solutions does with their smart supply chain management solution is that they collect data from a lot of different sources. And with that data, they can then bring this together into one dashboard that can tell us from collected data that comes from all over the world, from shipping companies and from even audits that's happening in the factory, these things, give us dashboards and an overview into what's happening in our supply chain. And what this means for business is, of course, then being able to predict a little bit better what's going to happen. If there's bad weather, then maybe there will be delays in our shipments, and we can then prepare a little bit better for that and even start looking for alternative solutions earlier on. So the third, a little bit broad, when we look at the business units here, first of all, the first three here are a little bit more about the business units where there's opportunities. And Inqova from Hong Kong and a lot of the manufacturers and the companies that we work with is very interested to look into sales and marketing optimization. So that's a very big and important topic for us when we talk then about customer data. So how does manufacturers actually work with customer data, and how can you start to understand and predict using customer data what customers need, what the trends are, and in order for them to actually meet those demands before they're actually there. Inqova is also a HubSpot certified partner, and we work specifically with the manufacturers in leather and textiles industry. Just to highlight what these CRM and what this really means today is also very much is a separate topic of its own, very much. But that also talks a lot about putting the customer in the middle and looking at mainly the three different core areas of sales or marketing, sales, and service. So then we're looking at specifically with HubSpot also how to work with manufacturers and these industrial companies on being able to do marketing, to get information out there, to be able to reach the right audience, to be able to actually optimize the sales process, to not waste time, to be able to make sure that we're doing things right through that process. And I think something that's very, very important is also the service aspects of that. So to be able to nurture lifelong or kind of long-standing relationships in the manufacturing industry is a very important thing. So to go a little bit back into also something different for since we're talking specifically about leather, just revisiting a little bit the leather value chain here. Now we've looked at, for example, how data in Industry 4.0 and how it can use in a bit more practical aspect is to optimize, you can say, 3 different business units areas. So if we look at a little bit of a different aspect of this, we can look at workflow simulation and how data is actually used throughout the supply chain a little bit differently. And if you go back then from kind of heights and the inputs and through the processing there, there's specifically 2 things that we've looked at. These are being talked a lot about already. One thing that is very important that is still in the very, very early days and is very different also between, for example, textiles and apparel, even within the textiles and apparel space, and also to leather, where we see, for example, that footwear is advancing quite rapidly in terms of 3D and product development and design using digital tools. So again, we're revisiting what we talked a little bit about earlier. Is when we talk about digital, what we're doing is we're going a little bit deeper into digitizing materials. So here, for example, like we can digitize a leather product, and we can then turn that leather product into new file formats that can then be used to be brought into design softwares. So once we then digitize these raw materials, then we're able to have a library of the leathers that we can then work with, and we can then work with 3D design softwares, and we can then do 3D assembly, and eventually also do presentations of these in 3D that looks more and more realistic, I would say, for every month that passes now. There's a lot of players in this space, and also in the leather industry, there's also different types of softwares and solutions for different types of products that you'll be making. But one topic that is also very important that I'll talk a little bit about after also is the material digitization and the importance of that moving forward. The key thing then, why I'm mentioning this and why I'm putting a little bit of emphasis on particularly this aspect of it, is also because when we're talking about both this 4th point here and the next one, which is traceability and transparency, these are also very closely linked to a big word that a lot of us are using all the time around sustainability. So what sustainability can also be said to mean and how that relates back to digital is also if we're able to now, for example, then digitize our leathers all the way even at the tannery level or at the source, we're able then to sample digitally, and we can then bring these digital samples into design software that we can then design our products in. We can then simulate, as I mentioned earlier, how these products will look like, and we can even simulate the performance of these products, and we can then also present these products even to consumers. And this has been done by a lot of companies already in different industries where 3D simulations or 3D renderings are being used all the way to sales catalogs for consumers, where consumers are then presented with images, or even in e-commerce that are actually 3D images that a lot of us are not even able to tell apart. So one thing to talk a little bit more specifically about how do we really go about this, and as I said also, if you talk about the center point here, the design element of this is it's really up to each and one of you, and depending on where you are in the leather value chain and what your products are, there are different solutions available here. Of course, also there are then different solutions for how you then present this, whether you're in a B2B setting or if you're with a brand that sells to consumers, and how you can allow, for example, innovation in this space digitally to also enable some new business model eventually. I want to focus a little bit also, since we're talking a lot about being in China, there's a lot of tanneries, there's a lot of manufacturing that happens in China. One important element will also be then digitizing materials. And when talking about this, talking also about how we can digitize and simulate in order to save natural resources. We've been working with an Australian company for the last year, which is called Bandicoot Imaging Sciences, and these are scientists that have been working with Canon R&D for a long time. Let's see here. And what we've been working with them on is how can we bring digitization of materials to the source. So in this case, that could be at the tanning process of when you're finishing the leather. And for example, in textiles and apparel, it's very much then also at the fabric mill level. So when you're working with fabric mill, and how can we bring these things into the fabric mill or the leather tanneries? And at the end of having the semi-finished product of the leather, we then digitize these materials. And what's very different here from, for example, taking a normal photo with your phone or with a camera is also just to use this image to illustrate, is that when we're talking about material digitization, it's a new type of file formats, and it's not just, as we know, an image that's very often a JPEG or a PNG or these type of file formats. We now have new file formats being used in industrial processing of, say, digital leather. And these are then broken down into multiple different texture layers that we can then use to give off and simulate a much more realistic look to the leather when we're then rendering this out. One question that I'm always getting specifically for the textiles and apparel industry, and I know it's also very important to leather, is also, what about the hand feel? What about all these other sensational aspects of the product itself? And that's something when we talk about digital forward is really important, but it was also a little bit of a different technology, and where we first of all talk about now using imaging sciences and being able to use technology that's available to create realistic visual renderings of the product that can be used and can be processed, as we already also laid out. And we're talking back to Industry 4.0, we're really talking about the processing of digital raw materials. And so this is the way that you go about this. And with this company also, tanneries and textile mills and fabric mills are able to now actually digitize fabrics and their semi-finished products and the leathers in the manufacturing site just by using a digital camera and a flash. And so that then allows them to send digital samples to brands around the world. And also why it's important, if some of you are also with the brands, it's important to start adopting 3D design tools that allows you to then take these digital samples in and use them for your own processing. So it's really collaboration across the supply chain that's very necessary here to work from brands, and that any designers and product developers out there to start to reskill and to relearn new tools that you can be using to design. And if you go quickly back here, this design aspect is very important if you're with a brand, and how you can then use that to create your product. And then it's more onto the manufacturing side, I believe, to then give you or to give the brands and designers and product developers the actual digital materials. So that's a little bit about the digital material aspect of this. And the last point to highlight as a business opportunity here is also talking about traceability and transparency. Of course, these two things are different things, but very closely related. And when we talk about traceability in the leather chain and transparency, we talk about data integrity and the validation of the quality, and being able to trace a product all the way from its source to its end product. So from farm to the finished product. And as we've already been mentioned this morning, is that there's a lot of talk about blockchain technologies and how that works. And there's different ways of doing traceability. One company that's been working also together with us at the Chrome-Free Leather Alliance that I've seen a lot of action from in the last year has been Sustainable Leather Foundation. And they've also been working on building a technology dashboard that will be able to work out a little bit more of a framework around how to put out traceability and transparency into the leather value chain. So just to very quickly look at that and how that looks like, we're talking about leather here and some of the practical elements of it. And of course, you would have to go into more detail with the Sustainable Leather Foundation on this, but they built a dashboard that relates specifically back to the ESG elements of leather. So we talked then about environmental compliance, social compliance, and governance. These elements are then broken down into a chart here, as you can see, that then covers the elements that makes up each of these ESG points, and then they're creating a system and a framework so that people to track and create transparency and traceability throughout the supply chain with this system in place. So, as I've mentioned now, we talked about the 5 kind of opportunities in this, whether you're on the brand side or whether you're on the manufacturing side. And why I also think that this is very important, and one of the big things when we talk about Industry 4.0, we're not just talking about manufacturing and talking about industrial processing and what's happening in the supply chain. We're actually also talking a lot about the enablement of new business models in the on the retail side of this. So this is going to be really important because now we've covered some manufacturing topics, we've covered some brand and retail topics here, but also to even look at some of the how does the consumer benefit from this. And that's where I've just highlighted three main things that I think is going to be really important moving forward. And that's number one, that consumers would value product customization more and more. And so if you're able to use some of these tools and work with manufacturers and throughout the value chain on digitizing and using digital tools that we talked about, then product customization becomes enabled from having digitization and digital available throughout the supply chain. What that really means would be that, for example, in an e-commerce store, this could allow someone to choose leather on their shoes in different colors. And of course, that also then gives them these personalized products that it becomes a little bit more unique and a little bit more different from their friends and other people's shoes around there. There's also case studies out there on how brands has been using this. For example, I'm aware that Nike has been using this as a way of being able to let customers customize their products, and then being able to use that data that's collected when people then buy their customized product to predict what's really going to be selling in the next and coming seasons in particular areas in the US, for example. This leads us, of course, also, if you're then going to be talking about product customization, we need a supply chain that's set up for that. And we also need to talk about on-demand production. So on-demand production also then very much comes from shifting from, as we're all used to and traditionally used to, then going from design, make, sell. Now we're talking a little bit more about design, sell, and then make. So that we're not, we can go back even to the process of using digital 3D design tools, is that if we can use digital materials, we can then create digital products. We can put these digital products in an e-commerce store or in front of the consumer to let them decide on what they would like. They can then buy something, and if we have that enabled throughout the leather value chain, and everyone is set up correctly, we can then be able to create the product after they're actually sold. When we talk about traceability and transparency, it's of course also very important to talk about the trustworthiness of the information. And why I believe that's important is also that there's not a lot of information available about the products that we buy today. And that's also a very important element of where technology can influence the future, is that with traceability and transparency, it allows us to get to know our products better. It's not just a label that, for example, talks about where the last process in the entire supply chain happened, and that's where it was made. That's all you can know about it. We can then in the future be able to build better stories with trustworthy information that are linked to blockchains and different types of technologies, and we can allow consumers to build a relationship with their products. And why I think that's important is that also the more of a relationship they can build with their products, the more they can care about the products. The more I can know about you, the more I can care about you, the more you can know about me, vice versa. And I think that that's something that, even though it sounds a little bit abstract to talk about our products that way, or the things that we own, I still think that that's a real thing, that information really helps us to care more about what we have. So just very broadly, we've covered a lot here. So also I have to kind of close this up a little bit broadly on what to do next. And just to summarize what we've talked about here in the last 25 minutes, is some three key takeaways from this is, I think we've gone over, and I hope you've also gotten a brief foundation of digital industry 1.0 to 4.0, a bit of background, something about digital innovation. And I hope that you'll be able to take that with you and break that down and be able to apply this to your own businesses. And we talked about the leather value chain 4.0 and these 5 opportunities, just to mention some, as operations, logistics, sales and marketing, specifically also in design and product development, and traceability and transparency. These are also important things to think about. How can your companies really use this when we now talk about Industry 4.0? Because we are in this age already, and we have a lot of these technologies available, and these technologies are there as tools to be able to bring us benefits. So the last thing that we talked a little bit about as well was also some of these new business models that this enables us, both through the supply chain and with working with manufacturers and suppliers, but also that with on the retail side, and also then shows us how important it is for the retail and the demand side to be very connected to the supply side of the industry. So what's next? If you wanted to look more into this and kind of talk about a few, let's say 4 dimensions that I can leave you with, and you could look into. If you do go about trying to apply this to your business, this talent that we've talked about this morning and that reskilling is very, very important. So that having expertise both on the digital side and also having expertise in with how we go about making things happen and executing these things are really important. And it's not something that someone can just come in and do for your company. It really requires, and a lot of times, the entire company to come on board. Some 4 key dimensions to really look at, I think, is important. They're also business process, business model, and also the domain that your business is in, and of course also the people element of this. And you can look more into this, and we could go a lot more into this, but I'm going to leave you with this for today. And also, if you would like to talk more about this, and if you want to talk more to me specifically about leather, textiles and apparel, and anything that we talked about today in a little bit more detail, I'd love to connect. Here's my WeChat QR code, my email, and my phone number. And as I said, I'm based in Hong Kong, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit more specifically about all of these things that we've now talked about. I hope you'll have a very good rest of the day, and thank you so much for having me and for taking the time to sit through. Any questions? I'm also very, very happy to answer any questions.
好，我们现场各位嘉宾。
Okay, any questions from the floor?
Okay, thank you, sir, for your sharing.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.